Hello everyone, welcome to the Breaking Out podcast, and in this episode, we will talk about why history should not be censored in Florida's public education system. The reason we decided to dig deep into this topic is to stand firm on why everyone deserves to learn about history. Although the truth may be brutal for some historical topics, the reality is that an understanding of history will greatly decrease the probability of horrible events happening again, as well as give light to those who have suffered in such events. The podcast is made for the intent of spreading awareness of the censorship in Florida's public education system. The writers and speakers of this podcast include Juan Rivera, Giancarlos Quesada, and Moises Galvez. In this podcast, we will talk about three main points as to why history should not be censored in Florida's public education. First, we will talk about the preservation of truth and how censoring parts of history may blind students on the bigger picture. Maybe the government is trying to hide some parts of history from students. Second, we will talk about acknowledging historical mistakes. The United States has their fair share of racism with African Americans. Blocking the reality of racism from students feeds lies that the U.S. was a very strong and inclusive country. Finally, we will talk about protecting freedom of speech and democracy. Censorship infringes on the people's liberty of freedom of speech, because students should be allowed to speak their minds about controversial historical events in class. The first topic I want to talk about is how politics is getting in the way of preserving the truth in the Florida public education system. Governor Ron DeSantis signed the 2022 Individual Freedom Act, which rewrites the requirements for instruction on African American history. Essentially, the act prohibits the teaching of critical race theory, limits how slavery and the civil rights era are taught, and bans how certain groups should feel responsible for past actions based on race, sex, and national origin. According to FEA President Andrew Spar, in response to this act, he states, "How can our students ever be equipped for the future if they don't have a full, honest picture of where we've come from?" Censoring education presents control of knowledge, which undermines the objective and evidence-based learning that school is meant to represent. Censorship can also help develop the government's agenda and specific ideas they want to indoctrinate people with. The government indoctrinating students this way harms students' ability to think critically and engage on historical topics because they lack the knowledge to even speak on the topic. As a demonstration, the Florida Education Department has said, slaves developed skills which, in some instances, could be applied for their personal benefit. Teachers have said that there is no evidence to back up this claim, and this is the type of thinking students will develop under the 2022 Individual Freedom Act. If the students would learn the truth, they would understand that slavery did nothing to benefit slaves, as the mental damage is far superior than any of the labor they have learned to do. Preserving the truth will help students learn right from wrong and preserve the objectivity of history for generations to come. In addition, the truth will allow teachers to freely teach knowledge and encourage academic freedom.
Our second topic is about how the censoring of history will twist the perspective of students and not allow them to see or acknowledge historical mistakes and their significance. As of recently, the Florida Department of Education changed its standards censoring what students can be taught regarding history, which has negative effects on the students. Censoring or revising history is never good, especially when dealing with sensitive topics such as the Holocaust and slavery. In 2023, 2 Holocaust textbooks were rejected in Florida after they did not meet the Florida Department of Education standards and included terminology that did not align with Florida law. The result of these 2 textbooks being rejected is massive, as students may not receive the proper education regarding the Holocaust and as a result, not acknowledge historical mistakes from this devastating event. This lack of knowledge can lead to students having a low understanding of the causes and consequences of the Holocaust, but also his significant lessons and mistakes from it. Another form of censorship that mirrors an event that took place slightly before the Holocaust is the book bans done by the Florida Department of Education. During the 2023 to 2024 school year, the Florida Department of Education banned over 700 books due to them featuring LGBTQ+ characters, discussions of gender and sexuality, and descriptions of sexual encounters. These book bans over seemingly nothing can be seen as ways to censor and limit what children are able to read, which mirrors the book burnings that took place a short while before the Holocaust, in which thousands of Jewish, Marxist, Bolshevik, and other disreputable or non-German books were burned. This book burning took place as the Nazi government of Germany not only wanted to promote their Nazi ideology, to censor what the German people could read, and to suppress ideas that they deemed were non-German. Taking both of these events into account, there are similarities that can be seen. The Florida book bannings are a way to censor and control what children can read, which mirrors the book burnings that took place before the Holocaust, where books that did not align with the Nazi government's values were burned. The Holocaust is not the only topic that this new curriculum is targeting, but also how students are taught about slavery. This is because the new standards require that teachers teach their students that slaves benefited from being enslaved, as they learned lessons that later helped them in life. Students will learn this, and it will make them think that slavery is not as bad as they thought, and as a result change how they view it, ultimately leading to them not realizing how bad it was and the historical mistakes that caused it and came with it. This is irrefutable evidence that the Florida Department of Education censoring history will cause students to get fed the wrong information and not be able to acknowledge historical mistakes from events such as the Holocaust.
Moving on to our last topic, how does censorship attack democracy and our freedom of speech? The Florida Constitution states that every person may speak, write, and publish sentiments on all subjects but shall be responsible for the abuse of that right. History should not be censored because it prohibits freedom of speech. Not being able to learn freely and teach those things to people around us will lead to disaster. The government of Florida must understand that limiting the knowledge available to us will encroach on our free speech. Having free speech is a central part of being an American, and if somebody restricted that right to teach others about topics that actually matter, then are we really Americans? Yes, certain topics may be harder to swallow than others, but that does not mean that we must ban them and never speak about them again. Forgetting the things that happened in the past only makes room for it to happen again. Democracy also plays a huge role in the censorship of history in schools. I use the word democracy as an umbrella term for basically everything that has to do with our freedoms in the United States of America. The Individual Freedom Act was previously mentioned, which cut a lot of appropriate historical education, especially African American studies. People in the state of Florida, however, saw the injustice occurring and decided to exercise one of their rights mentioned in both the Florida Constitution and the United States Constitution. According to AP, Florida students are giving up their Saturday mornings to learn about African American history at the Spady Cultural Heritage Museum in Delray Beach and in similar programs at the community centers across the state. They exercise their freedom of assembly because the censorship and inadequacy of African American courses is simply terrible. Having that information public and fortified would eliminate any reason for these people to have to meet on Saturday morning. But, at the end of the day, basic freedoms do not depend on whether or not history is being rewritten, but rather, they will exist forever.
History is one of the most important and useful subjects, as it teaches us America's past and gives us lessons on how to make a prosperous future for it. Not only that, but it also teaches us the country's failures to help us not repeat the same mistakes again. Because of this, we must reject any attempt by the Florida Department of Education to censor it and revise it, as if we do not, it will only lead to negative consequences. If we fail to reject this censorship, we should expect to see drastic consequences as a result. By censoring history, Florida students will not be able to learn history accurately, see the historical mistakes embedded in history, and put democracy at risk. By endangering history, we risk not having a bright future.
Thank you for listening to the Breaking Out podcast. We hope you enjoyed your listening experience and invite you to listen to our other episodes on Shakespeare's King Lear. This episode was recorded by Moises Galvez, Giancarlo Casala, and Juan Rivera. Special thanks to Juan Rivera for editing.